Welcome everyone to The Bottom Drawer. I'm Chelsea Pettitt, Head of Arts, and this series, presented by the Bagri Foundation, is aimed at writers. We are inviting them on the show to ask them about questions around their early efforts, unpublished writing, some of the things that inspired them to write, and often these are the things that end up in the bottom drawer. Today, we're privileged to have the author, Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai, join us. So please do add any questions you have in the comments section below, and we will endeavor to answer them in the coming days. Just a quick bio for Quế Mai. She was born in North Vietnam in 1973, which were the last years of the war, and of course witnessed the devastation on her country firsthand. She moved to South Vietnam at the age of 6 and worked as a street seller and rice farmer before winning a scholarship to attend university in Australia. She's the author of 8 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, published in Vietnamese, and her writing has been translated and published in more than 10 countries. Her work has received the Hanoi Writers Association Poetry of the Year Award in 2010, and she lives with her family in Jakarta, Indonesia, and joins us from there today. So welcome, Quế Mai, to the program.
Thank you so much thank you so much, Chelsea, for having me. It's a joy to talk to you.
Well, I was really looking forward to this. Congratulations on the release of your book, The Mountains Sing, in the UK this week. It's topped the recommendation lists and best of year lists in the US already. So we've been really looking forward to getting our hands on it. And I think based on everything I've seen on social media, everybody's been really excited to see this book and to read it and to talk about it. So just a quick recap about the book. It's a cross-generational story of the Tran family and how each generation was affected by this tumultuous period in Vietnam throughout the 20th century. But before we talk about the book, I just wanted to touch base a little bit about your early life, because this has obviously had a very clear influence on this particular book. And you mentioned in the acknowledgements that much of this is inspired by your family and those who you know experienced this period firsthand. So I just wondered, if you're comfortable with it, if you could tell us a little bit about your own experience learning about this period in your country and seeing it rebuild itself.
Yeah, so I was born and spent the first 6 years of my life in a small village in Ninh Bình. My village name is called Khương Dụ village, and it's a, it's very poor village, but also very beautiful. And I grew up, seeing a lot of bomb shelters around me, and also a lot of women waiting for the return of their loved ones. I remember flying my kite on the village dike and watching these women who stood unmoving, looking out to the rice field, looking out to the path that led to the town, like waiting for the return of the loved ones. And when my family moved to South Vietnam, we traveled by train, and it was my first time to venture out of my village. And during the days that we went through Vietnam on that train, traveling along Vietnam, I saw so many bomb craters. They were huge. And then when I arrived in south of Vietnam, again, I saw many women who were waiting for the return of their loved ones. And I saw many people without limbs, people who were deeply affected by the war. And also many historical events of my country, So later on when I grew up, and I love talking to people, Vietnamese people have this great tradition of storytelling. And I love to sit around older people, and listen to their stories. And I mean, 3 out of 4 of my grandparents had died before I was born. And my only surviving grandpa died shortly after. So I yearned to hear stories from older people. So I found myself, finding excuses to visit friends whenever I had time and listen and listen to the stories of elderly people. And I love to travel to my parents' villages when I grew up, and I spent a lot of time just talking to people, because I fear that a part of our history would be lost if these stories were lost, and so I don't know. I mean, from a very young age, I wanted to write a novel with a grandmother in it, to be able to have a grandma, and that was always my wish. And it took me so many years for me to be able to write The Mountains Sing.
Yeah, well, there was, I suppose before I get onto The Mountains Sing specifically, because as you said, it did come quite a bit later after you'd already published lots of poetry and other books in Vietnamese. How did you find yourself writing poetry? I mean, at what age were you actually expressing yourself in this way?
And so I always kept a diary.
Okay.
Diary. I think I began writing in my diary when I was maybe 7, 8 years old, and and I always loved reading poetry. Poetry is a part of the daily life of Vietnam. You hear poetry via Proverbs, via lullaby, and there always poetry program on the public radio. So I grew up without television.
Right, of course.
We hardly had electricity, but there was a public broadcast, like the loudspeaker that were hung on trees, and you had no choice but to listen to them, right? And they would start at 3:30 in the morning, calling people to get up and do morning exercise.
Wow.
And throughout the day, that would be broadcast of poetry reading. So I fell in love with poetry, and when I was studying, at the end of the year, we would pass on like a notebook to other students in the class, and like to write something that we would carry on to the next year, right? Because some of us would be leaving the class, and we always wrote poetry in there. If we can't write poetry, we would copy poetry from other poets whom we love. So poetry is very much a part of our lives. So I started. I mean, I always wrote poetry in my diary, but never published them. But I only seriously wrote poetry in the year 2008. 2006, 2007, 2008, I started that period. And I had, before that, I had lived outside Vietnam for quite a few years, and the joy of coming back was so great, that I started expressing myself in poetry. And I had a small scooter. I was riding to work every day on my scooter, and with the wind in my hair, I was writing poetry. And let me tell you,
poetry in your head. Oh,
yeah,
lovely.
it was an expensive hobby, because there was this particular crossroad that I always forgot to turn the blinker on when I turned right, and the policeman always waited for me there, and he find me so many times.
You were so distracted by your own poetry in your head that you'd miss your turn off.
And and this part of the city, Hanoi, was so beautiful. It's at the corner where the crossroad of two legs, two legs, and it's surrounded by trees. It's so very romantic. So I always lost myself coming to that area, and out came my poetry and also the traffic ticket.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Hanoi is a beautifully it is a city you can easily get lost amongst its beauty, all the trees and the lakes, and it's a beautiful place. So I can understand you going back and seeing that with fresh eyes again.
Yeah, and the people sitting on the street, and how you can watch the daily life of the people, out there on the street. And that's why I decided to set the novel, The Mountains Sing, in Hanoi, because it's really a city of my heart.
Oh, lovely. Well, You mentioned that you went away for a while. Was that your university studies in Australia? So how did that come about? Because you got a scholarship. So I was thinking that you must have been a natural writer at this point. But were you writing in English to get the scholarship? How did that come about?
It was, it was a dream come true, because I mean, I never dared to study overseas, but I mean, because my family was very poor, so my university had a small scholarship program, and out of I don't know, many hundreds of students, only 30 could get a scholarship.
Mm,
And with this scholarship, we didn't have to pay the university fee, right? And
great.
for me, that was a big motivation. So I studied day and night, and luckily I came out as the top first year student.
Oh, wow.
And one day at that time I was working every day. I was tutoring other students, like younger students, to have money to buy food. And one day I came home really late, and at that time I stayed in a dormitory. There were like 12 of us staying in a
Mhm,
small room. We slept on bunk beds.
mhm.
And then my roommates told me, "Oh, the principal just visited us, and he was looking for you because it seemed like you were selected for a competition for a scholarship." And like with this competition, they selected 40 students, like top first year students out of university all over Vietnam, and we would compete for like 25 scholarships to Australia. So I
So
mean,
exciting.
so it was so exciting and very scary. It was so
Yeah,
scary because my life depended on that scholarship. And
I can't
so
imagine the pressure.
yes, so I mean, like I studied so hard and I was so stressed. I
Mm.
could not, I could not sleep for days, but luckily I passed the exam and got the scholarship. And I mean, that opened really, the doors of the world to me.
Yeah. Well, in terms of that kind of early work and what you achieved through all your extremely hard studies, obviously it's paid off in the end. But how do you think your style has sort of developed or changed over the years?
I, when I was small, I had always wanted to be a writer, but my family told me no,
Mm,
because of the experiences, you know, um, that writers in Vietnam went through, and also because of my two brothers told me, "Oh, we don't have enough to eat, so do something useful with your life so you can help parents." In
yeah.
Vietnam, there's a duty of children to help the parents, and I understood that. So I went on in Australia to study business, but because I loved writing, so I chose business communication so that I could write. um, so when I started to write poetry, it was natural. I
Mhm.
had I hadn't kept up with poetry reading for many years when I studied in Australia. And when I came back to Vietnam, the joy of living there was just so great that I started writing poetry out of my own yearning to
Mhm.
get in touch with the language, with our culture, with my love for poetry again. So I wasn't influenced by anyone, but then the more I wrote, the more I understood the need to read. So I read widely, and I think the ability to read in English really also influenced me a lot. I mean, because for example, this year I've been reading so many books that have just come out in English, right, in the original format, and I'm able to read in Vietnamese too. So I think my readings of the two languages complement each other. And I just wanted to write in English but also maintain the Vietnamese quality of
Mm.
writing in English.
That would explain a little bit of the Vietnamese proverbs that you've woven into your book. And the kind of, now I understand why that would have been a natural a natural thing to do, not only for your kind of multilingual skills, but also because of the upbringing and having these poetry and proverbs as an everyday experience. That's nice, the way that's woven in throughout the book.
You know, because Proverbs are spoken in Vietnam in our daily life. So, you know, like I love translating Proverbs and you know, and I don't know, throughout the book, I didn't plan to use these proverbs. They just came out naturally in the speech of characters, you know, like trong cái rủi có cái may, good luck hides inside bad luck. And that implies that has a lot of application for everyday life, right? If you are met with something, you know, like uncomfortable, or you know, you can try to make the most of it. And also I love proverbs such as Musam Tamlo, persistent soft and persistent rain penetrates the earth better than a storm. So it's about the value of patience. Yeah. And heaven has eyes. Trời có mắt, heaven has eyes. No evil act escapes heaven's net.
Yeah, I really loved reading those proverbs and the way that you translated them throughout. And you're right. I think what's nice is that every culture in a way has their own kind of versions of this, you know, and it kind of, well, some of them are obviously very unique to a situation that might arise in Vietnam that we wouldn't necessarily have. But it's, you know, even when I'm thinking every cloud has a silver lining, there's a similar expectation, and I suppose understanding that someone reading it who doesn't speak Vietnamese can still relate to those proverbs, and also to the idea of those being passed down through generations as well is a really nice point in the book. But speaking of the book, it's kind of a nice segue to talk a bit more about The Mountains Sing, because we were saying earlier that it took you a little while to get to this point, and I wondered how long you had been working on this first draft, or, you know, all of these stories you've been collecting. How long did that take before it was finally published?
I think I've been collecting materials for this book throughout my life, because, you know, as a young girl, I had always wanted to write a book with an epic story about the history of Vietnam. So I paid attention along the way. So I started writing this book when I did a master in creative writing with the UK's Lancaster University. So I actually, you know, I was writing another book about another topic. And then one day I was traveling in the car with a friend, going to K-pop Chop self-defense class, which I also write in the novel.
Yes, I saw. Yeah.
I sat in the car with a Vietnamese friend, and who's older than me. And I asked him what had happened to him during the war. And he told me about the bombing of Hanoi in 1972, when he was, you know, alone with his grandma. His parents had been sent to Russia to work there. They work in the embassy, the Vietnamese embassy in Russia. And he was alone in Hanoi with his grandma. And it was his grandma who had protected him from the bombs. And his story was so moving. And that night I came home and I thought, that's it. I want to write this story, you know. I wanted me to be the little girl in Hanoi, and my grandma would be there to protect me from the bomb. And I knew how scary it would be, right? So then I had an idea to calm my nerves. My grandma would be telling me stories about her family. And this is how the story came about. Yeah. It took me 7 years to kind of, you know, from the start to the finish.
Wow, 7 years.
Yeah, and I think, and I started without knowing how the story would end. But I had a vision that I would need to build a big family, and each member of this family would witness, you know, a historical event of Vietnam.
Great. And that gives it a really good structure, obviously, to understand. But what I really liked was the idea of the storytelling. So it wasn't just, you know, from this perspective, from that perspective, from this perspective. Woven throughout, the grandmother was she was clearly telling the story to her granddaughter, instead of just sort of transporting us mentally from place to place, which made me sort of, you know, keep going through to look at, okay, which dates are we actually looking at here? Because there's so many important moments in history were happening at this time, and trying to understand all those historical moments throughout was, you know, my husband's a historian, so I kept sort of talking to him about, and my brother-in-law studied the Vietnam War, and so I'm sort of always trying to kind of relate these experiences to what's happening. And I loved how you had even voiced, because the granddaughter reads books from Western books, which you've woven in, she keeps talking about the empathy for others, or the empathy for the enemy in a way. And I liked how the overarching moral of the book almost felt like love can conquer all, and that love is something we all share. I just wonder if you think there's a kind of serendipity in the timing that this book has been released.
No, I need to go back to your point about, you know, the different historical events dealt with in my novel, because our history is so complex, and we were colonized and occupied by so many different foreign forces, you know. So I think the research process of this book was so complex, and when I wrote it, I had to bring everything together. So I had also made a historical timeline of the book, which is a part of my book club kit available on my website for those who are interested. So, you know, I mean, I wanted to stay faithful to these, to the real historical events of Vietnam, right? And I wanted to show how these historical events impact on the lives of the ordinary people. And like you said, you know, like love and empathy is so important, not just for the past, but for today's society. I think as a child growing up in Vietnam and seeing the devastation of war, I was so sure that there would be no other war. And I was thinking, as a child, I was like, you know, look at all of this. Look at how we humans do to other humans. You know, I was so sure that the human race could not be so stupid as to wage another war on earth, right? It was a naive thought from a young girl. But I mean, I'm really frustrated on how easily wars can take place nowadays, you know. And I think, and it's so easy for us to watch a war on TV and say that's not us, that's another world, you know. We don't belong there, it's so far away from us, it doesn't affect us. But I think each of us need to put ourselves into the situation of the other people. So there is no other, you know, like the human race, we are the same regardless of what nationality or what nation we belong to. You know, we all love our families, and we all long for peace, and we all need to have a normal life where we can celebrate, you know, the ordinary moments. And I think humans should really love humans more, and read more so that we can understand and have that same empathy.
Totally. I think, you know, for me, that's the power of these books, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. The reality is that these stories have happened, and they've happened to people around the world. And as you said, what The Mountains Sing was able to do for me, and I hope for other people, is to have a relation to these individuals. I mean, the relationships that are being played out. There was a particular part of the book that really made me cry. I don't want to give too much away, but the father-daughter relationship early on, you know, of course, comes to an abrupt and heartbreaking end. And I'm very close to my father, and it was extremely hard to read that and to think that a child would have witnessed something so heartbreaking. And I think it's so important to to write about these things and for people to understand that it wasn't just, you know, the other side suffering. It was those who were being attacked, and those ordinary people living, trying to survive. And I think constantly reminding everyone of the empathy for others hopefully will allow the next generation to not forget what has happened. But I guess that leads me to one of my questions for you, which is, did you feel a great responsibility to your family in sharing these experiences, I guess?
Some of the stories from the book are inspired by those experienced by my family. For example, the happening of the Great Hunger in 1945,
yeah,
when my grandmother was killed together with her younger son and with her brother. So they lost their lives together with 2 million Vietnamese. And I felt the need to document the horror of this event, which was a consequence of World War II, and it's so little known, right? So little. I mean, it's not documented widely in literature, and people should know about that. And also, you know, so I felt the responsibility, but I think this is also a work of fiction. So somehow it's, I think Tim O'Brien said in the book, you know, the things they carried, that sometimes fiction truth is truer than real life truth, because you can dig deeper into the emotions and the meaning. For example, my grandma was killed in the Great Hunger by someone who had tied her to corn plants. So because her children were so hungry that she decided to save them by venturing into a cornfield, the only cornfield in her village. And she tried to steal corn for her kids. And so she was captured by the guard of that field, who tied her into the corn plants. And she was too weak to kind of break free. And, you know, later on, you know, when my father told me about the horror of her death, I was very upset. And I wish so many bad things for this evil man, whom had since moved away from our village. And I wanted to write this book as a way of revenge, you know. I wanted to wish the many terrible things to him and his family. But you know what, in the end, what I found was forgiveness, because I knew that, you know, like you know, all of us have to bear the burden of our past somehow. And to break free of that past, we need to open up, understand, you know, other people's perspectives, and also forgive us and forgive others, so that, you know, our shoulders are less burdened, you know. And
I wonder then, because you have some kids, right? A couple of kids? 2 kids. And I suppose I wonder if you were thinking about, when you're writing, I was thinking about the idea of inherited trauma, but also through oral storytelling. And I wonder how you sort of, I guess, cope with that in your own life with your own children.
So actually, the way how to heal yourself from trauma is to talk about it, to write about it, you know, so you communalize your experience, so that you know you're not alone. So writing has helped me a lot, and I think I'm very lucky that my parents are very open with me. I think because of my interest in history, and because I've read a lot and I've talked to a lot of people, so I know what questions to ask, right? So they can open up to me about a lot of the very difficult things they went through. And I think we have helped each other in many ways. And, you know, in other families, I've seen violence, you know, I've seen family being broken up because there's lack of understanding, due to inability, you know, to share their trauma, or to help each other heal. So it's a difficult thing, and I think you know, it's important. I wrote this book for healing and for highlighting the need for all of us to help each other and to open up and to have dialogues and to talk to each other.
Yeah, well, I think that absolutely comes across. I really enjoyed it. I couldn't put it down. Every time I put it down, I kept thinking of the characters as I was going about my day, wanting to get back to them, to see what was happening, to see what was next for them. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you for talking about it in so much detail with me. And really for, you know, putting yourself through that, I suppose, and writing something that is so dear to the history of your own family and your own country. I really look forward to seeing what's next, but no pressure because it's just come out in the UK. So let's all enjoy this book first. But just to wrap up before we go, we have our kind of usual questions that we love to ask on the bottom drawer, which is really about recommendations and other kinds of writers and pieces of material that you might be interested in sharing with us. One of them, for example, is what is the book you wish you had written?
Well, there's so many books I wish I had written. You know, the Vietnamese epic Chuyện Kiều, The Tale of Kiều, is, you know, which is like written by the great poet Nguyễn in, you know, it's like a book of 3,200 verses of poetry.
Wow, okay.
So, you know, it's very well known, but it was my wish, and it is still my wish, to write a novel in poetry. So another novel in English, you need to read this, it's called The Sympathizer by Nguyẽ, that won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's one of the very rare novels that that uses the humor when he talks about the war. You know, there's dark humor in there, and it challenges the reader and opens, you know, and challenges our thoughts and attitudes and our thinking about Vietnam. And yeah, it's a fascinating book, and I love that book.
I should say at this point that anyone who isn't following you on Instagram should do so, because you are actively sharing lots of recommendations on Instagram, and I'm really enjoying everything that you're sharing. And I think you mentioned The Sympathizer, which sounds fantastic as a Pulitzer Prize winning book. So I'm looking forward to that one. I suppose the other one is, what is the book that made you want to write?
You know, it's like whenever I read a good book, I'm inspired to write. You know, that's the best job of being a writer, right? When you're stuck, I don't believe, I mean, there is something called the writer's block, but I don't really believe in it, because if your fire to write is low, you can always bring it up by reading so many good things out there. And you know, like, for example, I was rereading the book The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abe Dare. You know, it's about a Nigerian girl who really wants to continue her education to be able to have a loud voice. And you know, and I read that book and like, now I want to write more about girls in Vietnam and our fight for education, our fight for our rights, and you know, our fight for survival. And you know, I mean, every time I read a good book, I'm like, I need to write more, you know. And I think the great thing about reading is that you feel all the authors have done it, you know, and it looks so easy. Sometimes as a writer, you struggle and you think, geez, this is so hard, right?
Yeah.
And it is hard, and it is hard. So I mean, to read, to rediscover the joy of reading, and the joy and the reason why you wanted to be a writer in the first hand is important. In the first place, you wanted, sorry, I needed to say the sentence again. So to rediscover the reason why you wanted to be a writer in the first place is important, because you need to have that drive, that belief that the stories you're telling need to be told, you know, because being a writer is not for money, for fame, or for anything. It's about the love and the of literature, and about how and how to, you know, like get your stories out there, the stories of not just yourself, but of your own people, your community.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing to remind everyone in any job where you're, you know, expected to put something out there, that you reminding yourself why you do it and why it's important to you. I think with the foundation, you know, the work we do, we're constantly thinking, okay, we don't want to just shove everything out just because we have to. We want to remind ourselves, why are we doing this? Who's it for? What do we want to learn from it? You know, and try and sort of share that in a way that, yeah, keeps people motivated and excited for what's next. Absolutely. Well, I guess if there's anything else you want to end on, whether it's advice or another book or a writer that you think we all need to be reading, yeah, please do so now before we wrap up.
I think, you know, there's so many authors whom I would like to recommend, but I think because I'm a Vietnamese writer, so I would like to recommend books about Vietnam or the Vietnamese experiences. Right. So if you haven't read Ocean Vuong, he's one of my most favorite writers, and he you know, he brings poetry into his prose so beautifully, and his novel, yeah. On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, is a great read. Yeah. Another you know, Vietnamese American author whom I really admire is Thi Bui, you know, and her graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do, is so beautiful. It also documents the experiences of Vietnamese people throughout history, and she writes it as well as does the illustration. So it's a beautiful book. There's so much beautiful literature about Vietnam. So I hope that, you know, you keep reading translations too about Vietnam, from Vietnam, from Vietnamese people, you know. Thank you.
No, I hope so too. I think there's a lot more translation work going on. I think publishers are really looking to make more translations, so that, yeah, people have access to other voices, which is, I hope, a real push for publishing is moving in that direction, at least in our experience. That's happening. So thank you so much for joining, and I know you'll be on the circuit promoting the book throughout the UK. I highly recommend it to everyone who's listening, and also if there's any questions that anyone has, to please put them in the comments underneath, and I'll make sure that Quế Mai has the ability to try and answer any additional questions. But thank you so much for taking the time, Quế Mai. I know it's getting later in Indonesia, but I'm really glad we could connect. I think otherwise, you know, it might have been difficult to be able to promote this book in the UK, but luckily with technology, we're able to make this happen. And thanks again to you for, taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for this great conversation, and thank you to everyone who's been listening. I hope that you take care and stay safe during this pandemic, and I hope to be able to see you in person one day soon.
Me too.
Thank you.
Thanks.